at the Solari Report. I'm your host Elze van Hamelen, and today I have a very special returning guest, the researcher Clifford Carnicom. Clifford Carnicom has already been a Solari hero, but really, without being hyperbolic, he should win an award for his lifetime services and achievements. Over 25 years ago, Clifford started researching the global spraying, and he found a biological agent that actually currently seems to be playing a major role in the health issues that we are witnessing worldwide. His findings are of the utmost importance to health practitioners, to doctors in finding effective health solutions for the global population. In this interview, we will first summarize the first 20 years of Clifford's research. And of course, you cannot do 20 years of research justice. So if you want to refer to his papers, to his notebooks, which are very, very meticulous, this is very deep research, you can go to the carnicominstitute.org, or for the more recent papers to the Carnicom Institute Substack page. After going through the initial research, we are going into the COVID era discoveries. And if you are new to this topic, I have to warn, this is one of the most challenging and difficult topics to face at this moment, but also the most important one. So I would like to remind everyone of something that Catherine often states, which is, if we can face it, then God can fix it. And something that is actually a glimmer of hope is that the most recent findings of Clifford's research point to solutions. But his work takes place in a lab, and he's not a health practitioner. So what is needed right now are people in the health professions who take this lab research and will translate it into dietary, nutrition, and supplement protocols. But with that, Clifford, welcome.
Thank you very much, Elze. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak with you today.
Well, it's an honor. So increasingly, the global spraying is a topic that is discussed even among a lot of people. Very often I see this topic trending, and on social media, there are pictures being shared of all the spraying in the skies. But where this is new for a lot of people, you already discovered this 25 years ago and started researching what was being sprayed.
In the early part of 1999, an immense operation began, an operation that many of us would find difficult to accept were it not so well documented. This operation has involved a dispersal of massive amounts of fine materials into our atmosphere, and the implications of these actions are as grave and far-reaching as they strain the limits of understanding. What you are seeing now is quite normal. These temporary trails are called contrails, which is a word formed from the words condensation and trails. They are made of water vapor, and they are a common and natural occurrence, which happens as a result of aircraft flying at high altitudes, in particular ordinary weather conditions. You can see that the condensation disappears fairly quickly, much like your breath on a cold winter day. The aircraft at the upper portion of the screen leaves a normal contrail, which vanishes as any trail of water vapor will. To contrast, beneath it is an aircraft emission that is thick, continuous, and persistent. The environmental conditions accompanying each trail are not exceptionally different from one another, and yet the result and impact from each is entirely different. An aerosol is a substance made up of solid particles suspended either in a liquid or a gas, and in this case we can consider our own atmosphere to be a gas. Because in addition to the normal existence of clouds and contrails, aerosol sprays are being emitted from aircraft flying at high altitudes. Aerosols in the air can be seen in two primary forms: as an emission from aircraft and as a collection of suspended particles in the atmosphere. A suitable term for this collection of aerosols is an aerosol bank. It is known now that these persistent trails, known commonly as chemtrails, from the words chemical and trails, are not predominantly water vapor, like contrails, but are primarily solid in nature, because of the sheer volume of particulate matter they contain. These materials expand rather than evaporate, and they usually transform gradually into a uniform haze that has, in recent years, tremendously decreased our general visibility and has altered the deep blue of our skies into a pale blue or dirty white. Although it might be witnessed in any given period, this commonly now occurs during times of very low humidity, on the order of 30 to 40%, instead of the 70% or greater that is required of natural cloud formation. And so we know now that these are not clouds in any conventional sense. They are a unique and artificial creation. These aerosol emissions are now well entrenched into our air supply. These changes in the very air we breathe have a fundamental impact upon all life on this planet, and these aerosol operations, by their very nature, violate the most basic human rights.
What a lot of people are aware of are the metallic salts that are being found in rainwater. But in addition to the chemicals that you found a biological agent. Can you explain more about what you found?
Yes, Elze, in terms of the main division of the work, I have been operating since about the beginning of 1999 in the work. And over that 25 years, there's four main segments of the work that have evolved. They overlap each other, but each segment usually has several years of work invested in it. And those four categories would be that of the environmental aspects. The term geoengineering will come up, but that term is not adequate, as I will try to explain very soon. The second issue that arose was the emergence of a health condition that had very unusual characteristics that were shared and are shared with the environmental issues. And yet it was viewed as being sort of a distinct phase of change in the world. The third phase of the work would be that of what I would call a more direct confrontation and acknowledgement of the role of synthetic biology and how it has changed the world even further in a very deep way. And then the last level is the net effect of all three previous, and that is what I would call the risk to the human condition. Mm-hmm. You cannot keep stacking up environmental onslaughts. You cannot keep stacking up changes to human biology and health, and you cannot stack up the very alteration of life itself without reaching a point where you're actually threatening the human species, at least in its current form. Mm-hmm. So these are the four main divisions of the work, and I suppose we will be trying to work our way through those. But we're starting with the environmental aspect, and it won't be long before it'll be known that I take issue with what is perceived to be the state of affairs and what I think the actual state of affairs is. And what I think is not based on a belief system, it's based upon really exclusively laboratory study. When I'm speaking of years of work, I'm speaking of years of work of laboratory study, not conjecture. And so, and not to say that there was not activity before. I actually have very good reason to know of activity that was taking place as early as 1994. But my work started in 1998 when the first point of alteration was that of the atmosphere. And it was wrong, plain and simple. It was wrong and it remains wrong. And that crime, that infringement upon human rights is the alteration of our atmosphere without consent or knowledge. That's the crime. Now, the technical means of it, people might want to debate that, but the fact is that aircraft are the primary mechanism that we're speaking of. What you have is the release of massive amounts of particulate matter. We can discuss the nature of that particulate matter, but you have massive amounts disseminated in the atmosphere across the globe for a period of years on end, and in fact, it has never stopped. It's not customary pollution. We could go into that science forever. We won't have time for that. But you have this dispersal of massive amounts of material that have changed the atmosphere. Now, that's the start of it. It's not only the atmosphere that changes, because that which is in the air is subject to gravity, and it does fall down, and it will fall down. And it will be concluded ultimately that the planet is altered.
Extraordinary levels of particulate materials have been found, including the repeated presence of unusual filaments, a gel formation, crystals and powders. Electromagnetic devices which have been developed and used specifically for this research. Distilled rainwater samples to concentrate any solid materials or particulates. Observation of irregularities in normal radar activity. The tests reveal that as a result of the aerosol operations, samples of the atmosphere have been found to contain unusually high levels of the following. Metallic-based materials, a class of elements that have the property that they can become electrically charged with the energy from sunlight alone. One of the elements found in unusual and unexpected levels is barium. Unusual airborne filaments. Under a microscope, these fibers are seen to contain unusual biological components. Incredibly high mold counts are regularly found, surprisingly, even in the extremely dry environment of the high southwest. Additionally, testing has produced a variety of indications that the atmosphere is regularly being used for electromagnetic applications, which can have a very direct influence on the health of humans.
And your mention of metallic salts is something that showed up as a dominant characteristic, attribute within those early years. You will find about roughly 10 years of work devoted to the environmental aspect. Now, when you speak of metallic salts, as you mentioned earlier, a question raises many more questions. But this is where a split starts to occur in public perception and motive versus the actual state of affairs. Now, you could start with metallic salts just being a form of pollution. But if you look at that more deeply, you're going to find an electromagnetic aspect show up with that early in the game, right away. And my work was led to that conceptual framework very early in the game, because these are not just any particular metallic salts. They are metallic salts that have qualities of what's called ionization to induce electrical charge. Many people are familiar with the ionosphere, up in very upper reaches, 60 to 100 miles up, roughly, maybe something like that. And I'm speaking of that same concept of a charged layer of atmosphere, but now enveloping the lower Earth. Now, again, on the public perception issue, I would say, well, two terms. The first is, in those early years, you have the term global warming being associated with the phenomenon. Later on, that will transform into geoengineering. I regard both of those classifications as basically a front to attempt to appease public perception. And this issue, that geoengineering issue, was framed primarily in terms of public perception of one of climate control. Okay? This is how it was presented. It remains presented that way by those that have, let's say, a substantial platform in which to voice that opinion. The issue is not restricted to weather. Indeed, the issue does encompass weather, but that's one aspect of a much broader picture. When you start altering the Earth, and when you start altering it electromagnetically, and then as we will sequence into altering it biologically as well, you're talking about a much broader picture than weather manipulation.
From all data gathered at this point, there could be said to be 6 main reasons why aerosol operations are being conducted. 1. Modification and control of weather and the environment. 2. Electromagnetic operations. 3. Military operations. 4. Biological operations. 5. Planetary and geophysical change. 6. Sophisticated surveillance systems. There is an overlap that can make it difficult to discern where one program may start and another end. It's likely that many or all of these operations are being conducted at the same time.
And not only that, the perception has been foisted upon the population that somehow, it's never described how, but somehow this act of mediating global warming is somehow beneficial to us. Okay, both beneficial to us and done without consent. And that's a break in logic to begin with. If you're doing something good for people, I think you would want to talk about it. I think you'd want as many people to know what's going on as you can. So there are fundamental breaks in the presentation of even the earliest levels of the work under the term of geoengineering. I, because of the findings, had to again broaden that scope of consideration beyond physical alteration of the Earth from what would be called inorganic components. And this was the discovery, identification, finding, however you want to say it. And it's not just from me. My samples came from people across the world, and they sent them to me, and I studied them. And you had the appearance, along with the metallic salt class, you had the appearance of a very unusual filament material that appeared. We can say that this material does not fit in the natural world. This was a filament that has a size of less than a micron. And it is important to put size into perspective. Size is actually very important when you're dealing with identifying something. And a sense of scale would be that a human hair is roughly in the neighborhood of 60 to 100 microns across in diameter, thickness. An asbestos fiber is about 2 microns. I've looked at the spider web. That's a distraction. We could go on for some time ago. I have papers on all these topics, but spider webs came up roughly in the neighborhood of 7 to 10 to 12 microns. So I'm speaking of something that is less than a micron. Now, logically and immediately, you should have in your mind, I think, an equation that, just maybe I might be dealing with something that has an impact that could be even greater than that of asbestos. Okay. Now, many of us might know the attention that was placed on the asbestos issue over decades, but this scales out as smaller than that.
Spider webs, quote unquote, that hang in patterns or alone, unconnected to typical spider haunts. I learned that I was not alone in my observations of these peculiar webbings. In fact, people all over the world began to notice and record this puzzling phenomenon. The renowned Carnicom Institute was alerted early on about the misbehaving filaments and began an exhaustive 2 decades-long scientific investigation. Their shocking findings prove that these filaments, or, quote, webs, unquote, hanging from fences, caught on trees, and even covering whole fields are not from an arachnid source. They are not spider webs, as skeptics proclaimed. Extensive testing on these thin, delicate filaments was undertaken. The Carnicom Institute used top scientific, state-of-the-art microscopes, lab analysis, and a full range of spectroscopy instruments. Indeed, the more detailed and extensive the research, the more evident it became that Clifford Carnicom had found a previously undiscovered, environmentally and biologically active new filament that was entering our biosphere. Furthermore, the filaments tested positive for biogrowth properties. They also contained alarming proportions of metallic components, such as aluminum, iron, titanium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. The Carnicom Institute also sent out magnification data revealing that the fibers could not be spiderwebs, as claimed by so many detractors in the science community and media. Again, the EPA, that organization sworn to protect public health and safety, chose to ignore the increasing public concern. These growing filaments should be the basis for a scary science fiction movie, but they are real and measurable. Further testing found that they had a link to the skin affliction known as Morgellons. This should have galvanized the EPA and CDC into action. Morgellons is just one of the alarming symptoms from the human absorption of the web-like filaments and their nanoparticulate structures. How is this not of global concern? Why such censorship from the medical, science, and environmental groups?
Now, the issue, the real problem that arises is not only the existence of the filament, but the nature of the filament. And there is no question, no doubt whatsoever, anything that I speak of, I will refer you to the library, and there's roughly 450 to now maybe 500 papers going over this information we're speaking of in detail. But that filament has a biological nature to it. You will find, along with the inorganic work, that very early in the game, within the first year, that there was the incorporation of an issue of unknown dimension and proportions involving biologicals within those atmospheric samples. Now, this started to open up an entire Pandora's box that wasn't even slightly being talked about at the time. Now, to demonstrate the efforts and seriousness of the issue, this material that I am speaking of was sent to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the administrator of that agency, by certified mail. A very polite but assertive letter accompanied the sample and requested that the nature of the material be identified for the purpose of the public welfare and benefit. This was the purpose of the letter. And also, I would suggest that people read what the mission statement of the Environmental Protection Agency is when I tell you the response, because the response of that request was to hold that material for a year and a half with no acknowledgement of receipt of the physical sample. That was the first part of the response, to basically just put it in the back room, whatever it is, for a year and a half with no response other than to use the phrase, "We are not aware." This was their phrase of choice. "We are not aware of any unusual activity taking place in the atmosphere." After 1.5 years, a Freedom of Information Act was filed by a third party, not me, and that material was then, call it, quickly and suddenly released back to me, and when the FOIA was established. The response at that time, a year and a half after the submission, was that the EPA, they claim and state that they have no obligation whatsoever to identify any material of such an unknown nature unless they ask for the sample. Now, this is a fascinating case to attempt to make, because it falls apart legally to me completely when you look at their mission statement.
It's just a bureaucratic dodging answer.
It is, and the entire process we know is basically blanketed with bureaucratic responses. But I'm after the effect of that. What we have now, 25 years later, because of that decision and that position, which I think cannot be legally sustained, we are now subject to the consequences of what is in that filament material for succeeding 25 years. And this will it leads to a place that, let's just say, we never should be, but we are. And while I'm speaking of this, I do want to mention that there are actually three. I regard the EPA as culpable
Well,
for
wait,
the
because
consequence. Go ahead.
before, because the EPA didn't research it, but at the same time, while you were researching this, and the EPA had this sample stored, you had these visitors to your website. The Desert Research Institute in Nevada, which is a weather modification research institution, Fort Lewis Army Military Base, Lockheed Martin, Los Alamos National Laboratory, Raytheon, Boeing Aircraft, well, and a whole list of other military corporate institutions. So the EPA didn't look at it, but others were certainly very interested.
There's roughly 150 folks in that list that were, let's say, interested in the work that was taking place and being pronounced publicly. And it's far more vast than even the military-industrial complex. And that was a window of time when you could get such information, which you no longer can. I do hold the EPA culpable, at least from the standpoint of this country, for the consequences we have now faced since that time. In addition, I wish to mention three other agencies that also share a very significant degree of blame, if not equal. And the second of those would be the Centers for Disease Control. Each of these other three agencies, as well as the first one, they all have a story behind them. We won't have time to tell it, but at least it should be put on the record that there are, from direct experience and or contact, four governmental agencies that share culpability and blame for the situation we're in. So the second is the Centers for Disease Control, and another time I'll tell that story. The third is that of the United States Air Force, and that has a story. And number four is the U.S. Patent Office, and that has a story. And so at the highest level, we have had this obfuscation, which now leads us into the state of affairs we're in.
And also at the beginning stage, you were finding this biological agent everywhere. So in HEPA filters, because you conducted tests where you filtered the air with airplanes, blood, hair, saliva, plants, rainwater. Were there other parts where you found this biological agents?
Really, basically anywhere and everywhere that you can think of. It will show up in any fluid of the body. I actually did studies on plants. I did studies on animals. I did studies on children. I did studies of collection that range from just about any environmental method you could think of. I would go to 9,000-foot mountains and run filters up there. There is the truth is there is nowhere that I know of that's excluded from what I'm speaking of, and we must introduce a couple of terms as we go along here, and one will be this term CDB or cross-domain biology, and the other will be that of blood, because as distressing as it may be to some, these two forms of living matter are at the heart of the biology that we're speaking of, which I now will fully claim is incorporating synthetic biology.
Yeah, so perhaps you can explain, you coined this term after a lot of research because you first wanted other people to research it and perhaps coin the term, but you called this the cross-domain bacteria because it crosses three domains of life. Can you explain that?
Yes, within the filament that I'm speaking of, there is the appearance. There's several things going on. First of all, there's a very complex internal biology to the filament, also composed of what you might call inner filament structures. So even the submicron thing does not tell the whole story at all. In fact, the exterior casing of this filament is I regard it just as a housing. But within these filaments, along with the substructure, there is an appearance of what it might not be interesting to look at, but the assessment is that what it fits the best is out of a very extremely small bacterial species. This is what it best fits the description of. There's a whole paper written on this topic called cross-domain bacteria isolation. And in that paper, I list the rationale for the terminology, and it's very truthful. I did not want to give my own name to something. It's not the way science works. If you discover a species, you seek out to replicate the work, and then you give it a proper name in the scientific community. My work on that identification of this coccus form, roughly, and that coccus form, by the way, is also submicron, qualifies basically in the smallest category of life that exists. I started that in 2008, and I for 5 years I used the term bacterial-like entity or bacterial-like organism. It's very unwieldy, but I did this for 5 years in the papers because I did not want to take any role or assume a role for designating something which should be designated scientifically. After 5 years, I wrote a paper and said, I'm sorry, this game is over. I have given more than adequate time for the scientific community to come forth and apply some type of proper nomenclature. It did not happen. I was forced out of necessity and practicality to come up with the term. I did that. It is called cross-domain by bacteria at this point. At someday, I hope it receives a proper scientific designation as it deserves. But this, and by the way, it was not a whim that I came up with that term. There's a paper written. There's about 13 to 14 different criteria that I listed in order to apply and develop this term. And this is why and where the term cross-domain of bacteria came up. If you look at biology, let's say you identify or discover something that's not known. You want to try and classify it. And how do you do that? Well, there's a lot of ways you can go, but you start with things like size and geometry, and like I say, there'll be a dozen other things, staining, chemical tests you make. There's a whole series of things that you can do to try to apply that. You also can look at things morphologically and how they are structured, like fungi or multi-cell and single cell, this type of thing. The problem that came up with this particular living entity, and it is living because it does reproduce, it can be reproduced, and that's another part of what we'll talk about. But you have to adopt some kind of classification strategy, and the one that is now, I think, most commonly accepted is that of the domain system. A fellow's name was Woes, I think it was 1990. And what he did, instead of the idea of classifying something by its structure, he chose genetics as the basis of it. And what he did is he looked at all life on the earth, and he came up with a framework that consists of what are called domains, and there are 3 of them. One is called archaea, one is called bacteria, and the other one is called eukaryotes. It's very interesting when you look at these 3 because, first of all, bacteria, most of us would be familiar with that. Archaea are actually very similar to the bacteria in terms of size and shape and all. What's different about them primarily is the environment in which they can live. The archaea are also a relatively recent discovery. So what I'm saying here is that biology was completely rewritten. The rules of biology were completely rewritten in that 1990 when this system was created. And of course, there was a lot of controversy with it at the time, not so much now. So the archaea are known to live in very hostile environments. I'm talking about volcano thermal vents, geysers, this type of thing, harsh chemical environments. So that's 2. The third is a eukaryote. And guess what eukaryote is? Everything else except for bacteria and archaea. Now, this is pretty wild because this means except for these 2 little forms that are actually, microscopic, and to us, we don't even see, that the rest of life all is identified to have a common genetic origin called the eukaryote. The problem that I ran into when you looked at the properties, the characteristics, the morphology, the different forms that this thing could take, and the way that it expressed itself, as well as the environments that it could endure, this particular biology was able to cross all lines. Examples would be the ability to hold up under extremely harsh conditions. those conditions have not been tested fully. But I will say there's every reason to believe, in my case, that this thing could live in a dormant state in basically outer space. Okay, I have seen it in boiling water. I really don't know what the limits of that are, including heating. A lot of the culture work tested it from a heating standpoint, but the fundamental thing can exist. To my assessment at this point, there are no limits. The other side would be if we start dealing with human blood, and we will, or blood as a whole. If we bring that into the picture, and we are forced to, what domain deals with blood? It's going to be the eukaryote.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's going to be anything of a mammal species without any doubt. And the bacteria is actually a given because that's the most easily satisfied with the 14 criteria that I give. So we are speaking of a form of biology which I will transcend to the use of and transition to the use of the term synthetic biology, because that is what it is ultimately, crosses all domains of life, and that would mean genetically, as we know, and the word synthetic will be forced into the issue because it's very clearly a synthetic origin. You do not cross these lines at that level without a form of very serious intervention.
And you also see that this CBD, sort of cross-domain bacterium, that it produces all kinds of substances once it's cultured.
Absolutely. Well, let's go over four classes, maybe, if I can recall them. I'll list them and we'll see how much we'd like to talk about them. One will be proteins. Proteins are the structure of living beings. Your arm looks like your arm, and your face looks like your face because of proteins. A Chihuahua looks like a Chihuahua versus a Great Dane because of proteins. Proteins give structure to living entities, living creatures. Proteins are one. A second one would be a filament structure, a very unusual filament structure that is it's just a whole ball game in terms of what's going on there, and there are things known now about it. You have that exterior housing that is very, very hard to break down. You also have polymers. You have polymers being formed. Now,
Plastics.
Polymers would be in the nature of the common language would be plastics and rubber. These would be items that people could relate to. I will claim that it is not natural and it is not appropriate to have bacteria forms that can produce polymers within the human body. Okay. And let's see, what would be another one would be that of blood. I know this all sounds bizarre, but again, it doesn't matter what I think. Anything that I talk about, it's documented over and over and over. There is a form of synthetic blood that is produced by this organism. That work, if you study the work, it goes way back to early years. There were the first callings of, this looks like it satisfies the conditions of blood. And that was very bizarre, and that was very controversial when it was done. And I certainly received my amount of flack for doing that. But the work was done, and it was published. I come around, 15 years later, and start a new generation of work, and it reaches a point where I'm not just raising it as a prospect. I'm saying it exists. It is a form of synthetic blood, and that is verified by its geometry, its size, and even most specifically, the existence of hemoglobin that has been tested now also in earlier years, but now repeated and positively identified with the test of hemoglobin. It satisfies the conditions of a synthetic blood.
But it speaks again of this synthetic nature because blood is being produced in bone marrow and not in a petri dish.
You do not produce polymers, and you do not produce blood by a bacteria. And the only way you can do that, and by the way, in the world of synthetic biology, it's far more advanced than I did know. And we can do most anything you can possibly imagine. It is a bizarre world, but you can genetically modify a bacteria to produce anything with sufficient knowledge. And the simplest origin of that was the use of bacteria to produce insulin, which came from a cow, but you produce it inside a bacteria in a controlled environment. And that was really, as I see it, the onset of truly synthetic biology. It is a whole lot further on now than producing insulin. And the very existence of life and the nature of life is, let's say, in the culture dish. And you know what? It's beyond the culture dish.
Yes.
It's in our food. It's in living creatures. It's in our food supply. Okay? This is not a theoretical construct that I'm speaking of. We are playing God over the dominion of life.
So actually,
We being the human species.
the
Go ahead.
synthetic biology is something I described in the Solari Pharma Food report. Because, and I described the production of insulin there, but you see a massive investment in this. And McKinsey reporting the bio revolution, where they want to use the bacteria to produce all kinds of things. So foods, but also additives, industrial substances, wood fibers, milk without cows, butter without cows. So, but what you're describing is even way more advanced than what I read there.
And this was 25 to 30 years ago that this system was all in place, right? And what I'm realizing is we're still at the early stage of the work, because what we must now do is I must modify things, and I must take that term of geoengineering. I have three main categories here, 3 to 4 that I'm speaking of. First one, geoengineering. I'm trying to, let's say, relate to the public that this is not restricted to weather warfare, never was restricted to weather warfare, let alone climate. I will acknowledge its inclusion, but we must include the term and make the term known of bioengineering equal on par, if not more so, than that of geoengineering. It is earth modification and it is biological modification from the beginning. And those platforms that, let's say, have an unusually prominent presence proclaiming the restriction of this issue to that of weather modification, I will patently say that that platform is false. Always has been. I wrote a paper, I think it was 2016, I think is the date on it. And the paper is titled A Clash of Evidence. And it makes the case that a false premise has been established and received by the public on the restriction of this change. And this is the first level of change. And then the second level, what I have is a slide that shows 3 photographs. And the first is that of the geoengineering presentation, quote, geoengineering. Like I say, bioengineering has to be on par. The second is this term called Morgellons and what that issue is actually about. And then, and the last will be that of what I call the COVID era or the vax. And our discussion, as you choose and please, will also transition through those remaining stages. Because my claim will be that all of these stages are intricately interwoven and related to one another. They do not exist separately, and each one of them has a completely false perception by the public in terms of the scope and interrelationships between them.
So you mentioned the Morgellons disease. So you studied this as well, and this is where you found the same cross-domain bacteria. But these people were getting very sick from this. So do you think this was an allergic reaction, that it's in everyone, but for some people this played up, or did they just have a lot of this stuff in their body?
No, it's a systemic issue. The understanding how it evolved, I think, is helpful. You know, why did the work take that direction? And what happened was you had to work in the geoengineering and bioengineering with unknown dimensions, just an acknowledgement that there was something biological going on. It was very unusual involving blood. You have that, and then you have how that issue was managed. I call it information management. How that issue was managed to the public, and how it was considered to be just a rather minor thing that we don't need to tell you about. and how those people were treated and all the inquiries and all the requests made for investigation. I have a record of my set. They went on for years. This was the first logical response, is that people wrote to their politicians. They went to the environmental departments. They wrote to the Environmental Protection Agency. Go ahead and look at the responses of what they got, all the way from the Air Force on down to any environmental agency you can think of. The entire thing was always dismissed. Now, those people that were dealing with this issue and trying to raise the alarm, they were marginalized. There were serious efforts of discreditation. The early stages of, let's say, elimination of the competition and source of trouble was making its way in quite strongly. So you have this in place, and then what's going on concurrently? I think that my first paper was 2008. The early work had started in 1999. I think it was around 2008. You had the emergence of another, call it anomalous situation. And this time it involved human health. And yes, you had this term called Morgellons. I am basically immediately question the terms that are used and how they involve. I do not think language is an accident. And you had a term called Morgellons appear. And Morgellons was very quickly put into a category of a few people. First of all, they called them hotspots. Under the best of conditions, they called them hotspots. And that was even in the country, let alone what was happening in the globe. And it was presented as a skin disease. And by the way, skin means surface. A skin disease affecting a few people. And then very quickly along the way, and this is where the CDC comes into this picture, they were called delusional. There was a tag given to these people that no matter what they presented, direct physical evidence, that they were delusional, okay, that they were doing something that imagined this. And the CDC was the epitome of this in terms of making that proclamation what they did. Now, the issue here, go ahead.
Yes, because for the people who are not aware of this, we will show some pictures. Like the people who are suffering from this, they have open sores and they pull out these filaments and other like crystals and very exotic stuff out of their skin. And they have these wounds that won't heal. And they're being told that they're delusional.
Yes. Yeah. And this issue was confined and siloed in the same way that the geoengineering, bioengineering was. And you basically had a few nuts out there that had something going on with the skin. The truthful situation is that this biological alteration is a systemic assault upon the entire body from a practical standpoint. A skin is an excretory organ. The skin is trying to get rid of something. If you look at the science of what is going on, where it is in the body, how it's distributed, the effect on the body, this is an assault on the entire human body. There is nothing delusional about it whatsoever. It is documented very easily if you wish to look at the evidence. And the big trigger here is that one of the identifying features, there's many, because actually this is going to be my point. These things are all one and the same. I have three fundamental issues here, one being geoengineering, bioengineering, the second being the so-called Morgellons condition. Be cautious in terms of where that term originated from, and then the COVID era. The trigger here is that if you mentioned the word filaments showing up in the skin, right? Well, guess what we find? The nature of the filaments that come out of the skin, let alone what's happening inside the body, and the existence of the cross-domain bacteria throughout the body, including any bodily fluid you could imagine. The nature of the filament that is associated and results from this so-called condition is identical to that which originated from the geoengineering, bioengineering studies. Okay, they are the same. And this can be proven. Through the culture process, and there's many ways it can be proven. I have a paper. I started out. I have a paper. It leads to 6 or 7 papers, and the first paper is like there's a match between what's happening environmentally and what's happening biologically. If you step that through, the second paper will be a first and second match. I get to the point where it's 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th match, meaning all by different methods, different samples. I show that these things are one and the same thing. So we now we must view, quote, the Morgellons term. In retrospect, we are forced to view it in a light that is of equal broad dimension as the geoengineering, bioengineering complex. And any attempt to segregate these issues and restrict them to a particular time frame or a particular group of people, it's simply false. Anything that I am speaking of is a fundamental characteristic of the global human population now. It is not involving a few people. Geoengineering, bioengineering encompasses the entire globe. The existence of the CDB and the equation of that biology with that of the earlier work is across the globe.
So what this means is that because you find it in everyone, the human blood is changing. You found that already before the COVID era. There are changes in the protein chemistry in the body because of this cross-domain bacteria. Did you find an effect on the microbiome? Because the microbiome is completely made up of bacteria.
It by definition, it's a part of it, right? And by the way, I'll always allow for exceptions. Scientific process always tries to be fair. And I'll say this: I don't know of any human samples, any environmental samples that I have looked at where I will not be able to trace down the existence of this particular organism. But I'm not going to say that every human being is affected. I will say statistically, without any question, statistically, the global population is a subject of what has happened on as well as on the geoengineering aspect. So the microbiome is, how would I say it? It's one and the same thing. You know, I did receive that. You sent me a photograph actually from that document. I did see that. I took a quick glance at it. It's probably worthwhile on your side to hopefully have that on the screen. But I can give you my reaction to that document if you would like me to.
Yes, please. Also for the people listening, when I was researching pharma food, I noticed this interest in the microbiome and bacteria, and I noticed everything is almost being done through bacteria. And you have all these alphabet agencies that are studying all types of microbiomes, so of humans, of the soil, of the air. And so this is a cross list of all the types of microbiome research that's being conducted. And you wonder that there's this big omerta about the cross-domain bacteria, the most advanced synthetic life form that's ubiquitous, according to Clifford Carnicom's findings. So yeah, that's a big question mark. What is happening to the microbiome? Because something else that I wondered about was about mind control through the microbiome, because there was a lot of research about how your microbiome affects your state of mind. So people who are depressed and they get treatment, then it can help for their microbiome. It helps their depression, but of course, this also works the other way around. And there is a precision fermented medication that releases medication in your intestines, like by certain environmental triggers. So the possibilities of this are endless. And then with Clifford's research in the back of my mind, you have more questions than answers. I'm very curious about your take, Clifford.
Well, it shares what you speak of as well as maybe some additional comments, but it's essentially the same issue, and that is these are all related. It's hard for people when you present a picture that is so big and so complex that they don't know how to approach it, and I'm saying, and you're saying also, it actually everything that we're speaking of is all related to one another. There is nothing that is separate here. So you present this graphic to me, and this is basically called the microbiome project. I equate this to the genome project for the Human Genome Project versus now working with the microbiome. It looks like it's structured the same kind of way, where you have a multi-agency approach, and you say you're going to get to the bottom of things and learn all about the microbiome, being the aggregate combination of microbiology within the not just human biology, but biology in general. So when I look at this document, the first thing that I sort of perceive is that this is a public document. I'm assuming this is not a classified document, and I take this as a public document. So what that means is this is a public face of a project. Okay, it's not the classified aspect of it. I can assure you that there are classified aspects. There are covert aspects to what we're speaking of. In fact, that's been really the very problem that's been faced in the beginning, is the attempt to unravel a covert issue of the most greatest proportions that you could ever imagine, and basically reverse engineer that. Now, obviously, I do not have access to that information, but my first response is this is public. So this is what we're being told is happening. Okay? And what do you see? Well, it's presenting an impressive picture that, we have a couple dozen agencies that are just going to study the whole system, the whole eco biosystem, to get this problem under wraps, just like we did with the Human Genome Project. Now, always bear in mind that the synthetic biology I'm speaking of has a known origin of 25 years ago, known 25 to 30 years ago. Here we are speaking in this paper, which I think was authored in, this date on this says 2018 to 2022. Now, one is entitled to speculate just a little bit. And that is, I noticed one thing that's certainly very curious to me here. There'll be many, I'm sure I could notice many things that are curious, but one of them that attracts my curiosity is you have all these different aspects of the world going on. Agriculture, the 7 or 8 things listed, right? And then you have the agencies with them. Now, I have an interest here in that DoD column, especially, because look at that column, and what you see, it says that the DoD is interested in all of these. Now, that actually shouldn't surprise us. I wouldn't be in the slightest bit surprised. But what do I see there? I see a blank spot. Okay. I see a blank spot with the DoD on the atmosphere. Now, I'm not trying to restrict our discussion to the atmosphere. I'm just pointing out a little bit of a curiosity, is that in light of what we have spoken of, if you're willing to read those 450 papers and a decade of work devoted to atmospheric studies and the nature of change within it, is it feasible for you to consider that the DoD does not have some type of interest in atmospheric modification and change? Does that seem feasible and sensible to you? And my response is no. That's not feasible, and that's not sensible. In fact, it's so overt to me that it's omitted. Okay, you actually you made the express effort to omit that little X in that one category. Now, what would be a motive for doing that? Okay, why would you remove just that X if you're going across what you're? By nature, the other guides are all going to include the atmosphere at some point. I of course am being slightly suggestive and facetious here, but I'm saying from a standpoint of logic, you can conclude on your own mind. I will make the claim that the DoD is involved in every one of those little boxes, has been. I looked up the budget of the defense military spending. It's on the order of 20 to 30% of every dollar raised is somehow associated with the military. And back in 1960, it was up to 50%. Okay, so think about your money and think about a third of it and where it's going. And do you think that box deserves to be empty?
No, but that way, if there's a FOIA request, they can say it's not part of our study. So
remember, the Air Force was in the picture here as a culpable agency. So I just find it, this is a public face. This is not. So the other aspect of this, besides that little curiosity here, is that since we're saying it's the public face, I will contend to you that there is a classified face to this that you simply are not seeing. And I know that origin goes easily back in a documented way the 25 to 30 years that we're speaking of, at a level far above anything you're even considering in this public face document.
Mm-hmm. So I think perhaps now we're at, like, we summarized most of your, like I said before, we cannot summarize 20 years of research and doing it justice, but we summarized important parts to go to the COVID era. So in 2019, you studied all that you could study by the laboratory and the funding that you set up yourself, and you closed your lab. But then during COVID, all this news started to emerge about people noticing weird things in blood that were very new to the doctors and other people studying this. But for you, this was not new at all. So that brought you back to the research and the more current findings.
Yes, the third stage of this work, if we look at it, in those categories, would be what I would call the COVID era influence. And that's my own term just because I see it as another stage, another segment of the work. As you said, my work reached, you would call it a sort of a summary state of affairs within my means, as you described, near the close of 2019. The COVID era spans, at least by the graphs I'm seeing, spans roughly 3 years, starting in 2020 through 2023. Roughly in that range is where you have this era of a new dimension of change and alteration to the you can call it on an almost elementary level, alteration of the human biology. Okay, something was done that affects human biology, and of course you can debate that forever. But this is a significant period of time. I'm at a point where I'm not in capacity to actually perform laboratory work at the same level anymore, but I observe. I always am observing. And I'm always looking for patterns, as I did in crossing between the first two stages of the work that we spoke of. And I look for patterns, and there's a lot of curiosity already in terms of what I call information management, how an issue is managed, how it is shaped for perception by the public. And we don't really need to debate that, but I think we can say quite clearly that this whole COVID era was probably the most historic propaganda campaign that's ever existed in the history of mankind. And so from that standpoint, it's not very difficult to see the patterns if you're looking for them. Also, the imposition of probably the highest levels of censorship and inhibition of free speech, as well as professional health comment and commentary and advisories given. Also, probably the greatest level ever in human historic proportion. So it's not too hard to recognize those type of patterns within it. More and more of us are now acknowledging that existence of manipulation. But well into I guess it was the latter third, in that last year, I did have a question that was starting to arise in my mind, a couple of questions. One would be the way that people were managed and handled and instructed to perceive an issue, the same as I had seen before. And the other issue was the increasing discussion of blood and blood alteration. And something that was starting to, let's say, cause some alarm. I'm always so diplomatic in my terms. I don't want to use the FEAR word, but the fact is there was alarm now being expressed about alterations in blood that appear to be associated with this particular event. Again, I can't separate because I look at things in conjunction here. And it got to the point where the word blood clot was coming up more and more often. And it became very overt at some point, because at some point you had undertakers saying, I'm seeing something I've never seen before. I'm just seeing these massive clots in people. I mean, massive. I saw photographs of several feet long. Okay. And then I also always watch how information is managed, always.
So did you see these clots before 2020 in your study?
Well, this is going to come up within our discussion. The answer is going to be, there is a continuous thread of evidence for the development and existence of clotting mechanisms in the blood from 1999 forward. That's going to be the general answer, okay? And then we have to try and parse this out in terms of what does it mean in terms of the COVID era. Now, so we have a situation where it's reaching a level of undertakers saying, I've just never seen anything like this before, and they're providing direct evidence. And then in my world, if somebody does that, it's like, hey, I want to know what's going on. I don't want to shut the person down and take away his license. I want to know what's going on. I am that way. I think it's actually the true human nature to not just be a subject or a victim of somebody telling this is about your life. It's about human life. But that's not what was done. Licenses were taken away. People were censored, and they were presented as being quacks. Right. This is the strategies are just as common as could be. At some point, you need to acknowledge it instead of trying to find an excuse for it or debate it. The fact is, it happens. People are destroyed right and left on a continuous basis when they legitimately raise valid science, arguments, and logic against a operation that could almost be viewed as without consent. It can be. It was often mandated, right? I mean, I know people that they lost their careers over and over. This wasn't just some voluntary thing where you sign up. The pressure was immense for people.
Well, and then there's consent and informed consent. And then also, if you see the level of psychological operations that were unleashed to convince people that this was safe and effective, you can also have some question marks with the consent.
Absolutely. What you call consent, if you're going to lose your career with it, how much of a consent is that? And that was extremely common. So going back to now this blood clotting, I'm not running the lab, but I'm watching. And I, of course, am curious because a very logical, sensible question here is there anything different in blood, okay, going on? And I don't have access to data the way that I did before. But what happens in that latter third of the COVID area is I do start looking at some blood samples. And they're totally random people. As a matter of fact, I think all of them, I think, but either way, the majority of them were not vaccinated individuals. And my samples are small, but I work statistically, and it's fair, the work that I do. I do the best I can with what I have. And I had a sample set, and something very unusual appeared within these slides that I was looking at. And understand, I have been looking at blood for 25 years, but something was different. It certainly appeared to be different. What was different was the level of what I would call aggregation or coagulation of a typical blood dry slide smear preparation. The blood was not behaving in the same way, and certainly it bothered me. But it was I have to seek answers. I'm going, it looks like something's different. And the first thing I had to do was I had to start looking at live blood because whatever happened was completely in place by the time I looked at it on a dry slide. So I got to where I needed to see it instantaneous. And so this spawned the creation of a paper, and it ended up being a paper series. I didn't know all where it was going. It starts out by just saying, is there anything different going on? And the first paper reports on this observation. There's something going on here with aggregation of blood. So this paper goes through 6 stages. So the first one goes through that. I won't go through all 6, But second, not in any detail. The second one establishes the means and methods that I'm going to use, even though I didn't have a full lab. Let's just say I had some means available to me, and I used those means. Electrochemistry and microscopy were the two main tools I had available in a portable sense. And so I went after establishing methods that would be more than a microscope. Microscope is a good start, but hardly gives you a very comprehensive picture of a lot of things that are happening. So I developed the methods. And then, there's two things that happen here that are very, very important during the stage. The first, to back up to what we're seeking right now, I looked at these clots. Under the scope.
Mhm.
Now, you have to understand that I have this history of 25 to 30 years of seeing things over and over and over. And so, of course, I'm establishing similarities or identifying differences as I see them. But I had 3 different clot samples. There weren't enough to form any kind of vaccinated versus unvaccinated control set. But some of them were from dead and some were actually from living people.
Both vaccinated and unvaccinated.
Yes, I think the majority of them actually would be unvaccinated, but it's a small sample to begin with. Getting blood clots out of an individual was not necessarily an easy thing, and I appreciate certain support that was given for that. I don't have direct access to that. So I looked at these clots, and the answer to what is making them up, let's say, was very familiar to me. Now, I know where you've got this underlying question, vax versus no vax, but I'm just looking at what I see. And what I see is these clots, they're made of, guess what? Exactly the same thing. And this is actually just under the microscope. I'm going to get to another state of work involving electrical current, but just sheer looking at them. And later on, I would support that with other work, particularly near infrared. I also had access to near infrared spectroscopy as well as electrochemical spectroscopy. The result was that the composition of these blood clots was of the same nature that had been defining this emerging biology that was being discovered for the 20 years prior. And what does this mean? What it means is the blood clots had 4 major components to them. They had filaments, exactly of the same shape and size. They had the CDB, the cross-domain bacteria. That's something that will measure submicron coccus form. They will have a protein nature to them. Remember, protein is structure. So if you see something of form, which there's mass, then proteins are almost certainly going to be involved. And then you had this other addition that I have to say, not entirely new, definitely not entirely new, but far more pronounced. And that was this issue of polymer. Okay. I would say that would be, if there was a distinguishing characteristic there, it would be the role that a polymer played. Polymers will come up within the first year that I write my papers, but this is different. So what do you have? You have a composition that is straightforward in terms of the observation and straightforward in terms of the correlations that can be made. But I will say you don't have a whole lot of discussion taking place in the general world about these observations. And as a matter of fact, you have quite a few folks attributing um, identifying it as a new phenomenon that, hey, we're seeing these filaments and making the conclusion in essence that these filaments are coming from the result of the vaccine situation, right? The CDB are too small for them to usually see, but the filaments, I just have to say, there was mislabeling, there's simplistic labeling of something that is highly complex biologically. So this is what happens. So this is one of your first clues that it looks like you have another relationship taking place here. You may not know what the relationships are exactly, but you have overlap now occurring between all 3 of these major eras of the work. Now, there was another stage, if I can discuss the other significant stage of this work, and I'll interrupt because it looks like you'd like to ask something.
Yes, because another thing as a non-scientist, what I noticed is that the people from the Morgellons sufferers, they would post pictures of kind of little crystals or things that look like sharp metal, or almost they have a very technological structure. So some people say perhaps it's a microchip, but the same things were posted for vaccinated and unvaccinated people in the blood. And I wonder if you also saw these metallic and crystal structures in your cultures.
Yes, yes, yes. The history of crystals were let's say they were never properly answered. There's a lot of, getting answers at the level I want. They were not ever answered adequately. But yes, particularly a hexagon crystal is very, very early in the work as being quite unusual. Right?
Because that leads to another question for me, because this cross-domain bacteria is obviously from an organic nature, but then it's producing this stuff that seems technological. So there's this biotechnological convergence. And what I wondered is if it's making crystals or metal structures, is it possible to do that with the materials that are already present in the body? Because something that I was reminded of, and perhaps this is what they call high octane speculation at Solari. So in the other report about the farmers and fishermen, I dived into the history of industrial agriculture. And this seems a jump, but I will explain. So what happens is you separate the agriculture from cattle farming, and you have the mineral depletion in the soil and actually the microbiome depletion, but we have the mineral depletion in our bodies. And at the same time of this introduction of industrial agriculture, you have the chemical explosion, and it's the introduction of plastics and pesticides and all types of chemicals in the environment that are now, so when your body is depleted of minerals, for example, iodine, you start attracting halogens, and your body starts absorbing more heavy metals that used to be deep in the ground and not in the environment. So I would say that our bodies were already very polluted before the introduction of this cross-domain bacteria. But now I wonder that if this type of pollution of the plastics and the metals, if that's actually it gives kind of building blocks for this thing to construct or build with.
We can't separate these things the same way. You cannot separate the crossover between environmental and internal health and biology. What you can do is attempt to make inroads on a level of separation, however meager it is. And this is where the culture process comes in. The culture process is an effort to create a controlled environment to see what happens within an environment. And then you have to make your projections as to how far you think that carries into human biology. But this is a primary means of trying to come up with some type of separation. Otherwise, you're left and you can't keep saying these issues cross over one another. You can do that forever. At some point, you have to refine it and define it to a particular aspect or problem and make progress and make inroads on that. So the culture process is one of the main means that I would state is available to us to try and work on this problem. What I can say in response to what you're mentioning here is that I have many generations of culture work, roughly 5 different stages over 25 years. And each one I would regard as an advancement of knowledge and understanding, however slow, in the nature of the chemistry and biology of this synthetic biology. And you will find one or at least 2 papers in that Substack. In other words, the Substack is basically the post-COVID era. You will find 1 or 2 papers devoted exclusively towards the issue of crystal biology and what was found. And it's quite remarkable. And I know other people have found things, but in terms of my work, that work originated from the culture environment. Okay. It has one contribution from the human being in it, and that's 1 drop of blood. That's all that's required. Okay. Everything else is a controlled environment and not an external general environment where anything goes and you don't know what's happening. Amazing developments took place, and they were recorded and presented on papers. And I think the title of that paper is Exotic exotic biological crystals and what that meant, and the field of research of biological crystals. Again, I don't want to generalize it because I know everything's related, but that was a specific set of observations. But there are so many dimensions to the culture aspect alone. Okay, and one way I could say it is that if you change one thing, and I think I could allow you to think of anything, if you change one thing within that culture environment, or one thing that affects that culture environment, the culture result will vary some. Okay, there are the mainstay is in place. This is where it's done over and over and over and over, and redundancy to the nth degree. So you establish certain principles from that. But in terms of its susceptibility to variation, it's extreme. Okay, and crystals, biological crystals, are one aspect of that. If I can, if we have enough time, I think it's worthwhile mentioning another aspect of this work when blood was first studied.
Okay.
We're not even talking about the 24 papers on Substack yet. We're talking about just the work that set the stage for the Substack papers, or the recent papers for the last 2 years. And this was a electrical aspect of the work. I mentioned that microscopy was involved in near infrared. There was some work done with electrochemistry, and electrochemistry is a valuable tool for getting at inorganics of a material, particularly metals and this type of thing. And so a part of this, if you look at that 6-page series, 6-paper series of work done on the blood in the latter third of the COVID era, where I'm seeing something that's unusual about coagulation, the application of electrical current was a part of that work. Now, when I was applying that electrical current, it was not for the purpose of studying what the impact of electrical current was upon the blood. It was using electrochemistry for what they call redox reactions to identify primarily inorganics. That was the reason for the work, to get compositional information about the nature of blood. And there were also some division between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals did exist at that point, but very, very small samples. So that was the purpose, and I did that work, and that's all presented. The components, metals, and everything that I found, that's all listed within that 6-paper series. But something else happened, and I could not imagine or foresee that in any way conceivable when I started this work. In fact, it's still, it is out of the science fiction stories in terms of what actually happened. And that is, I was dealing with very small levels of current on the order of a couple milliamps type thing. You don't need much current for the type of thing that I'm doing there in electrochemistry. And what happened was I noticed the blood was just was visibly having quite a strong reaction. And there were separations taking place. And I'll give a little clue here. Many, many years ago, I got interested in foam being produced. And I started to ask, what is it that's foam made of? And we've all heard of the rivers with pollution and the foam on the water and this type of stuff. And that was sort of my consideration at the time. But along the way, I learned that there would be at least 2 main categories where you see a foam type product. And one would be the pollution, but the other would be that of proteins. And that wasn't quite so obvious to me at the time. But let's say I had a frothy material that was being produced, and I had a separation. I had a separation between an upper and a lower level. Well, of course, you start by looking. You have the separation. I didn't know what it meant. You start by looking it out under the microscope. And the simplest way of saying this, and it is profound, there's no way I can get around this, but what you thought was blood as you started out with, it simply no longer looked like blood. It was not recognizable as blood. There was no cellular structure left. And what you did see, you remember when I identified the nature of the blood clot that we spoke of? And I went over those 4 things? Well, guess what I saw? As a result of the application of electrocurrent, exactly the same thing. Unrecognizable as blood and consisting of, and this is unreal actually when you think about it, because there's something very unusual that's going on here. these filaments, it takes time. In our minds, it takes time to construct a filament. It's a process. At least this is what I would perceive. And something phenomenal happened here is that the changes I saw, they're not instantaneous. My period of time was about 2 hours, roughly. But within 2 hours, I had structures appearing that were as complex as anything I had seen in prior culture work, as well as the original EPA studies and quote, Merkelen studies. It was like essentially a complete transformation in a fairly instantaneous basis of human blood to a point that was not recognizable, that corresponds exactly with what I now claim is fully and entirely that of synthetic biology. This was profound.
At the trigger of a very low electrical current.
Yes, and I did other tests. I got curious because my work was involved, the electrochemistry is actually involved with both AC and DC currents, and not to get too technical about it, but that distinction is an important one to make when you're working with electricity. And I initially thought that somehow it might be dependent upon the alternating current, which would be a more generally considered as a more sophisticated form of current that would tie into the whole thing of frequency and waves, this type of thing. But what I tested that idea and hypothesis, and I eventually found that I got the same results with DC current. And that means it's a much simpler model that's going on. Okay, DC current is just a steady flow. There is no frequency. So I got these results, and I have published these results, and they exist. And in my world, there's not much attention being made to something that is absolutely profound to me. And I'll also mention that this work was replicated. There was not many people will take the effort, it seems, to replicate the work, but there was an individual that did replicate the work. He's got exactly the same results that can all be looked up if a person wishes to.
Because what I wonder about is in the same period, you had this massive extra electrification through 5G. So you start wondering if that has effects on the blood clots. And I also wonder, because I know that people who are electro-hypersensitive, they show the rouleau effect, so the blood clotting, also just in response to exposure to EMFs. But of course, the people who research that, they are not aware of the CBD. So it's a CBD in combination of EMFs that perhaps are able to do the blood clotting.
Live blood analysis and electrosmog. We can learn much by looking at our blood under a microscope. This short video shows a macrophage, which is like a vacuum cleaner, engulfing bacteria among red blood cells. I decided to find out what my blood looked like. I pricked my finger, placed a drop of blood on a slide, and looked at it under the microscope. This is what I saw. The cells are round, some are separate, and a few are sticking together. Overall, fairly healthy-looking blood. This testing was done in a clean electromagnetic environment, and I did not eat or drink before or during testing. I then worked on a computer for 70 minutes and looked at my blood again. This time, the cells are sticking together like stacked coins. This is called rouleau formation. Later that day, I used a cordless phone for 10 minutes and looked at my blood again. And this is what I saw. Very unhealthy-looking blood. There are virtually no single cells. Most of the cells are now in rouleau formation. A doctor told me this is what she sees with cancer patients. What I learned is that my blood goes into rouleau formation when I use a computer or a mobile phone. This type of clumping interferes with the release of oxygen and the removal of waste products like carbon dioxide.
The capillaries are so narrow that red cells must squeeze through in single file, showing the importance of their elasticity.
What are the consequences of rouleau formation? Poor circulation resulting in lower oxygen transport to cells and reduced waste removal. What are the symptoms someone may experience? Headaches and fatigue, difficulty concentrating, numbness, tingling, and cold extremities, and possibly heart and blood pressure problems, including risk of stroke. What is the significance of this? Live blood analysis may be a good diagnostic for electrohypersensitivity.
Correct. Not required at this point, but let's say maybe further developed or enhanced. But we do know there was a transformation taking place. I can produce the equivalent of a blood clot without the application of current. You might be dealing with a trade-off of time there, basically, for those to equate to one another. In relation to what you're discussing, the fifth article of the sixth, the title of the fifth paper out of the set of six is called Blood Alterations 5: Sources of Current. So what this paper was about was that after I had made this observation, which I never intended to run into, totally, completely separate from the actual inorganic analysis part, you now are forced to ask another question. I never anticipated this paper, but when you're left with that result, there is a pressing question that comes forth, and that is, could this happen in the real world? That's the question. Okay, I've done this in a laboratory controlled situation, and what really catches my attention is that I'm using extremely low levels of current. That's what catches my attention. It wasn't like some, high level thing. And I asked the question, could this happen in the real world? And I started that inquiry, and that paper is the summary and presentation of that information. In the end, you will find about roughly a dozen to 14 methods by which it is feasible to me to consider that currents of that magnitude could be generated within the human body. And it's an interesting list, but in the end, it will encompass the electromagnetic soup that we have created for ourselves in this world. And that includes everything from weapon systems to communication systems to our little devices, sticking your phone up to your ear. It will encompass everything. But it's an interesting paper because of the conclusion of the paper is there are many, many, many sources of current that could be induced in the human body that might equate and can equate, at least from a theoretical standpoint, with the levels that were required with that particular result. So I do regard it as profound. And to try to complete this discussion, there was one more paper that I had to write, and it's only a paragraph or two. I got away very easy on this one. It was one or two paragraphs, and the subtitle. What was it? Let's see what's the main title. Yeah, no, the main title says it. The last paper is called Blood Alteration 6: Implications and Consequences. And that is, I had to try to put all of this information together and into a question of what is the net effect of this? And, first of all, you have to establish, is this real? I had to accept the conclusion that the work was real. I did it. Other people replicated it. And so there was no way I could avoid this conclusion. Again, I'm not a person that tries to sensationalize. I do not work from a fear-based position. I work from a informed and human spiritual point of view in terms of the laws of nature and the rights of man as they were granted by nature. And when I saw this, I had to introduce a phrase, and I didn't like it to do it, but I had to do it. And that phrase was kill switch. There's a lot of popular terms out there that, people love to use buzzwords to get circulation. I don't do that. In fact, I intentionally usually try to tone things down sometimes where it's so obtuse that people don't even know what I'm talking about. But in this case, I had to use the phrase kill switch because it was the most logical, simplest explanation of what it is that had been witnessed, both from a theoretical, conceptual, as well as a result point of view. Because if you accept these results, one has to conclude, and that includes all the sources of current, one has to conclude that it is conceivable, whether it's, I'm not talking about yes or no, it exists. I'm saying, is it conceivable that a mechanism exists? And please do not attach fear to me. Could it exterminate the human race? And my answer was yes. Again, it's not something people want to hear, but I go by the facts of the case. The facts of the case say that it is conceivable that uh, that such an end result could be achieved. And you get into all interesting kinds of discussions, EMPs, events from outside this planet about, fluctuations of current, magnetosphere, solar. You get involved with all kinds of interesting things. But it is not inconceivable, and I did have to use that phrase, and I tried to tone it down and say, there's another option too, and I used the word selective decimation, and that is, okay, I don't have to wipe out the whole species. I could say, there's this particular group in this particular country, in this mountain region, and they're causing me some problems, and I could do some things that might just knock them out of commission. I could do that on a group basis. I could do it on a regional basis. I could do it on an individual basis.
Taking in account the electromagnetic soup, it's almost a miracle that we're still alive, considering.
You come to the same place I am in terms of, do you realize what we're in, what the soup is? And again, this is not based on fear. It's based upon objective work with no agenda in place, other than my agenda was to identify inorganic components of the blood results subject to current.
Well, and it also brings us back to your earlier research that focused on the effect of electromagnetics. At the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned the geoengineering part is changing the ionosphere. It's changing the electromagnetic skin of the sky. But we are absorbing this stuff. And you also wrote papers about the CBC changing our own electromagnetic field. So in addition to this biological component, there was from the onset also a very strong electromagnetic component.
Absolutely. I spent several years working and writing on electromagnetic influences with an emphasis upon ELF energy. Paper after paper after paper, driving out, trying to find the most remote areas I could. I got to the point where I was in places there wasn't anything around me at all. I had to have some equipment and transportation. Nothing around me except a power line, maybe 5 or 10 miles away. Mm-hmm. And I was, my work was sensitive enough that I was able to detect the influence of that power line upon my work. And that meant I could separate it. I was after ELF energy in a very systematic way for several years, all tied in with that original work of ionization and alteration of the atmosphere from a electromagnetic perspective. And thank you for recalling that too, by the way.
Yeah, because this was discussed between you and Catherine in one of the older interviews at Solari. So for the people who want to listen to that, they can listen to that. But these findings, both the blood coagulation as the electrical effect is for both unvaccinated and vaccinated alike. But in your subsequent research, you also find differences between we're talking about the words, we shouldn't call it vaccinations. These are not vaccinations, whatever these concoctions are. But there are differences between injected and uninjected people. And it seems to be that, so the coagulation, the source of it is the CBD, but if you are injected, then these effects, they take on much faster. Would that be correct?
This is what the work shows. Yeah, what the work shows a relationship that's emerging. It started about 3 or 4 papers ago, and it's been confirmed at a stronger level really quite recently, within the last week or two, with the availability of a separate instrument. And I'll also mention, by the way, I think in every single case, and if I didn't, you let me know, but in every single case, when I use the word vaccination in my paper, I put quotation marks around it every single time. And I usually will give it a modifier of the word purported vaccinations in quotes. So full understanding and agreement there. I do not regard it in that class at all. But the question, another one of those burning, nagging questions underneath the surface, which is never, to me, never being answered properly. Still isn't. I made, I think, an initial foray into the problem in question. But this nagging question is there an identifiable difference between those that have received? I'll use the term to simplify all my qualifiers. I make injection versus no injection. Okay. Is there a difference? And I'll tell you, that's a very elusive, difficult problem. And that's not accidental that it's an elusive, difficult problem. Because, first of all, if you knew what was in the vaccine, quote, again, language, if you knew what was in the injection, then you'd have something to work with.
Yes.
And guess what? That starts with the very nature of the problem to begin with. Look at the inserts and find out what information is on there. Okay. So you don't know what's in them properly. Certainly not from a public disclosure point of view. I can't speak for those that have, some type of inside track, but I certainly have no access to it. If I did, I'd be studying them. So you don't even know what's in them. Okay. You don't generally have any acknowledgement of the depth and role that synthetic biology has played for 25 to 30 years. Okay. And you have a time frame in your mind that somehow thinks the last 2 years of your life may be important, but last 25 must be old history and not interesting on Facebook anymore. That's all old news. And so you're myopic in your whole approach to the problem, and you're trying to ask what are the differences. Well, let's just say you're ill-equipped. We're all ill-equipped to answer the problem at this point until we have everything on the table. And one of the first parts is you learn what the heck is in something. What I have done is I have finally, for some instrumentation is important. I have a tool that I've let's just say wanted for some time. I used to have it in the old lab, but it gives you deeper information on molecular alteration or change in a sample. So I have an instrumental advantage I didn't have. I also very slowly, with quite a bit of work, have acquired a sample set that's large enough to justify itself statistically, at least for me to present. And I have a group of quote unvaxxed individuals that are enough to be of interest to me statistically. I have looked at those, and for the first time, I had a hint of one possible difference earlier on. In general, I'm totally dissatisfied with this progress across the world. There's no reason whatsoever we should be so ignorant. But I did what I could, and I looked at these two sample sets, and I looked for differences between them, and these differences exist at the molecular level. The field is that of called mid-infrared spectroscopy, and I looked at them as statistically. It works all there that I do. It took me 2 to 3 weeks of steady work. There's 350 peaks that were analyzed. It's a statistically redundant sample, and I do come up with some differences. And what the differences state, again, it's often too generalized for people to accept the significance of. But for me, it's not, because you're after this question, and it starts with this answer. And the answer in this case is that, yes, there is a difference. There is a difference in molecular structure. There's a molecular alterations that the evidence shows are taking place in the quote vaccinated versus unvaccinated sample. There appears to be an identifiable difference in the molecular structure. This gets into the whole thing of functional groups that you and I had spoken of one time earlier. We're not going to get into all of that, but the essence of it is there is now worthy consideration of a repeatable method of seeking the answer to whether or not there are identifiable differences, that's a mouthful, of identifiable differences between a control group and those receiving an injection. That's a very significant state of affairs, which has been lagging and bothering many of us And I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I'm saying, again, I have another path of investigation that I think is worthy of answering more completely.
So, because I think this research that shows, it also gives an explanation of why so many people, they have the kind of brain fog. I notice a lot of people who did take the injections, they get ill all the time. They get tired very early. And what you found was a metallic molecule that disrupts the oxygen transport of hemoglobin. Changes in protein chemistry. So protein misfolding, inhibiting enzyme activity. So as you say, these proteins are basically our basic chemistry of our body. So if that messes up, then your most basic processes are being messed up. And then there are the changes in fatty acid and lipids. And of course, our cell membranes are affected. So if your cells are in ill health, of course, you have some general malaise. So I think these research findings, I'm not a scientist, but they are so important for people to understand why people are getting sick. And if you understand the root cause, then you can start looking for solutions. But if you don't understand the underlying mechanisms, you just remain completely in the dark. And what I wanted to ask is, because you mentioned earlier the content of the injections, because of course there was Operation Warp Speed and everything is still, there was never any disclosure about the real content of the injections. But the candidates, of course, they say there's mRNA in it that's wrapped in hydrogel. But an interesting finding is that you also found that the CBD produces hydrogel. You have a whole paper on this. We found DNA contamination. In Japan, metals were found, and they stopped these batches. They even halted the campaign for a while, I believe. And people saying they have found graphene oxide. But I wonder, are some of these ingredients perhaps confused with the CBD and the things that the CBD produces?
How about a one-word answer? Yes, I don't get away with that very often. I'll say the word yes. There's tremendous confusion, obfuscation, misrepresentation, speculation, and conjecture. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but yes, it's a muddled mess in terms of knowing what's causing what. And I'm just saying the very first thing you're required to do, whether you like it or not, you're required to examine the record of evidence from a scientific standpoint over 25 to 30 years, and you don't get away with staying within your 2-year time frame. It's simply not allowable. It's not logical, it's not sensible, and you can never get the answers at all that you seek. I think what I'll do is try to, I mean, you were correct. You made a summary statement that there's an exacerbation taking place, it looks like, from the COVID era, and this is the net result. To be specific about the lines of distinction that I can make thus far, and it's the blood clotting that seemed to trigger, the overt, visible blood clotting that seemed to trigger the more contemporary interest, because they can see it and it's dramatic and it scares people, is what it amounts to, with good cause. So that's sort of the turning point. But if you look at the lines of distinction, the history of the work and the current, all the way up through the current time frame, demonstrates that the existence of the CDB alone, by themselves, no other known influences. We admit the existence of the admission of a drop of blood into the system and what that might mean. But from a practical standpoint, from what we can see, the existence of the CDB alone and the medium that is required to support that growth and reproduction is by itself alone, no ties with anything else, that basically the culturing process alone is sufficient to present and justify the development of and existence of what can be stated in no simpler terms than that of a blood clot. It's all that is required. to produce those four things. If you look at the blood clot, the CDB alone is sufficient to do that. Now you come into the line of distinction, and people are starting to ask, well, did you see those clots before? Now, I have a picture that I'll show here that you'll have to find, I suppose, but I realized, the question is, did you see evidence of clotting before?
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I would answer that is that the precursors were all there in place all the time if you simply look at them. This paper was written in 2007. This paper was written and the paper is titled Morgellons: Airborne Skin and Blood, a Match. That's the title of this paper in 2007. And you'll see the pictures of the filament structures, the interior structure of everything I'm talking about. And then you'll see this photograph that you can assess it as no other than a conglomerated structure of filaments and CDB and surrounding blood cells. And the proteins are also in that same series of work that was done. You see this within a direct blood sample of 2007. Okay, so I didn't know ahead of time that I was heading towards the situation where an undertaker was going to find a 3-foot clot and pull it out of somebody's leg. But why do you think that I was concerned about this? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I let's just say I would acknowledge very quickly that there's not supposed to be filament in your blood. Okay, and that's a bad sign. And what would be the expected impact of filaments in your blood? So I didn't focus on the word clot per se. What I called it damage. I called it a problem. Okay, I called it a damage. That's what I did. But that picture pretty clearly shows to me the precedent for the existence of clotting mechanisms in the blood from the CDB, i.e. synthetic biology. Now, the distinction is, but the difference is this is not an externally manifested, removed from the body form that is dominated by what you'd call a polymer or a rubber-like nature.
Mm-hmm.
This does not appear to have that depth of structure development in it. Enough to be a problem, but not the polymer aspect seems to be not at this level. But by the way, polymers were observed very early in the game, across the board, just never in a developed sense the way they are now in the they have been now. They are in the lab. It's done. I can produce those 3 or 4 types. But the distinction is that we know that the evidence says we have a difference between injected versus non-injected people.
Mm-hmm.
The anecdotal evidence indicates there was the emergence of more prominent, more structural forms of clotting that occurred in the body with the advent of the COVID era. A reasonable proposition can be put forth that the differences that we're speaking of, and now the very known capability, the CDB already has the full capability to produce 3 to 4 types of polymers. And they reach the point of being literally a rubber type material. So it's all in there. But it would appear, it's reasonable to presume that the injection process may indeed have either accelerated or enhanced or exacerbated the actual physical structural formation process of clotting, which you made reference to earlier. But I think with the current state of knowledge, this is what I would be looking for as a difference, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. So to go through your next phase in the COVID era, your next phase of research, you seek to understand the underlying chemistry of the CBD and what it produces. And by understanding this chemistry, you also discovered suggestions for mitigation strategies, because this is one of the things that is tricky is, of course, you're not a doctor, you're not a health practitioner, you're a researcher. And what you find is in your culture, it's in a laboratory, but based on that, you cannot give health advice. So what we will do now is then discuss some of this chemistry. And what will be really needed is people who are doctors who will go to your research and translate your findings into health protocols, correct?
Absolutely correct. And at the latter part of our discussion, I get to announce a condition and qualification to what I require on my side of the picture, coming from a nonprofit point of view. So at some point, I will introduce that so people understand where I'm coming from. But in terms of the more immediate question, and everything that you say is correct from the very beginning, I do not get involved in. I never would state any particular protocol that an individual would take. It's just totally inappropriate. Unfortunately, I think even for the doctoral profession, it's sometimes totally inappropriate what is done. But I'm not here to pass judgment on that. But I'm going to say that it's not my position, so I simply will not do it. But I certainly do have the role, and I claim that right from the very beginning. I have the role and the right to present the objective factual information, and I'm able to glean and acquire about the nature of this problem. And so in my world, first I'll say and acknowledge that there are many, many ways to approach a problem. And I would never want to be regarded as a person that thinks of themselves as following the path, okay, to answers to a problem. Life is full of all of us, and we all, hopefully in good faith, make our contributions. So there's many ways to approach a problem, and I acknowledge those, and I say, go to it. If I had a dozen different lives, I'd be working on 12 different fronts. I just have to make choices. The route that I have chosen in my work, and this was this winter session I've made some reference to in the past, but it's a unique period where I've had access to a lab for a period of time. That will be changing very, very soon. So it has been a very intense session, but there's two main questions that are logical. And I established priorities is what I do. I say I have limited time. I have a limited life. I have priorities. And the priorities that came up over this last year or two is, is there a difference in the blood? And then number two would be, if there is a difference, then what's causing it? Looks like there'll be three questions. What do we think could be at the heart of the problem? And number three is, what might we do about it? What course of action might we plan to do about it is even more important from my standpoint. People want a pill. I'm sorry, they love pills and devices. It's really strange to me. The whole devicing is really weird, because I know from experience that there's some kind of human attraction to a device. This is my own personal judgment, opinion. But people have this attraction to a device, something that does something, and then they just love it, that somehow this is going to solve their problem. But I will say this. I know from experience and observation that being hooked up to a device is not a liberating experience in life, okay? If you have to go into a dialysis machine and hook yourself up, that is not liberating. And yes, you might think it's worth it, but it's a real drag, basically, to be hooked up or tethered to something. And devices are really not very much fun, would be my position. But I understand there does seem to be an appeal. So my route in my work has been, on this last question, is there anything we can do about it, or a plan, even more importantly, a pathway to do about this, is that of organic chemistry. It is the path I've chosen. It can start with a straight organic chemistry textbook. I have been involved easily in 24 disciplines in this work. I have my professional background where I focus and devote a certain thing, amount of attention on problems. But in this case, I'm coming from more than a dozen different directions of scientific fields. So I cannot profess to know everything, and I do not. But I am willing to study and learn. And organic chemistry, if I say, what is the purpose of organic chemistry? And actually, it's chemistry in general. It's not confined to organic. Chemistry is a study of matter. And I ask myself, what do I have and what is the highest priority? What I have is matter in front of me, namely blood. And I need to understand the physical dynamics of what is taking place within that matter. and we can go different directions. I chose chemistry by priority. And so it does start with a textbook. I start from square one all the time. And I've been working on it for years. And it's a very slow process, but I keep trying to learn a little bit. And it's getting a little bit better. The more you learn, the more rewarding it is. But I know very little. I know that. But a few things that I do know and why I chose to take that route. I'll give you an example. Organic chemistry is a very complex field. I have the utmost respect for people in really almost any profession there is. It doesn't matter what it is. If they've devoted their lives to something, I just have the utmost respect for that, whether it's spectroscopy or communication or law, because organic chemistry, I can just barely scratch the surface to it. But I can pick up the main points, and sometimes I'm good at that to weed through all the stuff and find out what's important. And organic chemistry is pretty neat in that once you get to a certain point, you understand that no matter how complicated something is, and that's a problem. These things are so immense. These fields are so immense that you don't know how do you approach this thing. And chemistry is definitely that way. But I know enough now to know that no matter how complicated and big something is, there is a branch of chemistry called functional groups. And I wrote about these in 1999 or 2000. I started writing about functional groups when I started to discover their importance. And functional groups, no matter how complicated it is, there are certain structures that are known to be reactive. And this is the key. No matter what's going on, how big it is, there are certain chemical groupings, molecular groupings, that are the point of reaction. And this is a key thing, okay, to try and to work your way through the maze of having some synthetic biology, working from the tail end, trying to understand what it is, right? Well, you want a problem, you've got a problem. But if you understand this, that if you can work on that chemistry enough to identify what are called functional groups, certain groupings of molecules, this is where the reactions are going to take place. And that's very powerful information if you're willing to get to that point of study. You know, what's called functional medicine always interests me a lot because these guys are about the who and what and why of what's happening in the body. I really love what they do, as well as nutritionists. There's a lot of people I admire. But my work has focused on the effort to, first of all, control an environment of growth for the synthetic biology. And that's been done, like I said, in 5 successive generations, each one adding on a little layer of knowledge. And then once you have that controlled environment, to try and learn and understand the chemistry enough to where you can identify those functional groups within it. And then sometimes you get lucky enough to carry that forward to a specific identification of a specific compound. That's a nice treat when you get there. But if you get to the point of identifying functional groups, you have made progress. Now, most people don't seem to be interested in that because they, like I said, I'm not trying to be judgmental, but they seem like a pill and they seem like a device. But to me, the pathway of knowledge and interaction with this problem, one of them is this business of understanding the functional group chemistry of the synthetic biology.
Well, if you know what triggers it, then you can also inhibit the.
Well, this is where you go. This is all purpose for it, right? If you understand what it's about reactivity. To think that something could be immensely complex, but you might be able to reduce that. Maybe you're going to be able to reduce that down to a half a dozen critical functional groups. Okay, examples would be alcohols. Okay, protein interactions. My goodness, acids. If you were to be able to reduce this down to a set where you knew they were the reactive molecules, well, what a wonderful focus that is. Absolutely wonderful. Because I'll put it this way, I'll say it this way. Every single functional group is a known point of reactivity and is exactly as you hit upon. This means once you understand it, you now get to set forward strategies and considerations of interfering with that reactivity. And if you're really optimistic, you might go so far as to be hopeful and eager to discover if termination is possible.
And you already found this in the lab, right? You're very...
A series of functional groups are very readily now established. They are presented in really almost all the papers. They're all listed. The mitigation level is operating at a different level because of what you mentioned. I'm not in the business of establishing protocols for people. I'm going to go ahead and state this so that people understand where I'm coming from. I operate a nonprofit organization. A nonprofit organization is devoted to charity, both by law as well as by principle. It is this law and these principles to which I am bound, both ethically and morally. I have certain histories that I've made references to. I've had certain difficulties and complications in my life. And let's just say most of the time they do seem to center around an agenda or an ulterior motive or the love of pictures of George Washington on a piece of paper. I've had these, but I've weathered my storms through them. But I'm at a point now where I'll say this, I think there is I don't want to overstate it, but I think there is significant benefit in potential in the log of my work, even beyond the published papers. And that is, I keep laboratory notebooks, and I have for many, many years, and I have roughly 33 volumes of them. Those 33 volumes are all posted on the net. You're free to go through them. Nobody has any fun because they're in my handwriting and they can't read them. But I basically have a log of everything I've done for 10 years, or probably in 4,000 or 5,000 pages. That's in addition to the 4,000 or 5,000 pages that I have publicly presented within research papers. So there is a log there, and it's in quite detail. It's a lot of things that are going on. It's my learning journey also in chemistry, willing to admit I know nothing when I start. And that work on the website is actually available very close to, there's one other small addition I'll make, through the end of 2023. That's all publicly available. You could be downloading them now. Usually what happens is people say, yeah, I'm downloading, but I can't read them. Okay, but I'm sorry, that's what we have. I was using pen and paper all the time for 33 books. I'm going to make a distinction from 2024 onward. There is a significant volume of work. I don't even know what it is yet. I'm going to guess there could be up to a couple thousand pages of work in 2024. They will be readable because I did switch over to a digital format. People will wonder why I didn't do that before. The answer is the work got so complex I couldn't keep up with it, and I had to pull in different sources. I have another significant aspect to my work. I'll go ahead and say when I die, you're going to get it one way or another when I die, but I'm not pushing that. I hope to be able to do some more work. I have a requirement, and I'm sorry, it's the way it is. I've decided. I am a nonprofit. My work is for charity. The public deserves the help. They need the help. And I have a problem with people making a dollar off of somebody's misfortune. The release of my 2024 laboratory notebooks will be to formal nonprofits that have demonstrated a track record of serving charity and the public good. That is a process that I have initiated. I have defined that on the most recent papers, what my intention is to do. And I will be seeking inquiries from those that will satisfy that requirement. You're not to make money. I'm not saying a dollar can't be made. You have nonprofits that have budgets of millions of dollars, of course, scores of millions of dollars. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I come from a nonprofit charity basis from the very beginning, and in essence, it is intellectual property. And at this point, this work will be released in that fashion. 98% of that work is already publicly available. I would surmise and assess in my own mind that there are some significant advantages that might be found in this last 6 months of work, but that's my condition. And I guess I would say I would encourage you to place appropriate and suitable nonprofits in contact with me as soon as possible, because if you want to accelerate the process, that's what I'll do. And not only that, I will assist and confer in the understanding of any of that work, and that means my handwriting, which means I might be obligated for 10 years to translate it. I will assist others in the interpretation of that work and understanding of it, if I know that their motives are doing exactly that, serving the public good in a charitable fashion. I don't know if that's considered mean or angry, but that's what I'm going to do.
No, I think that's not mean or angry at all. It's very good to know that there's not, again, that it won't be put in some kind of dustbin, or somebody is profiting of somebody else's misery again. And what I really liked about your mitigation strategies in your latest papers is that you say it's fairly easy, nutritional changes, probably supplemental changes. So it's not the development of a whole type of new pharmaceutical products, for example.
Everything that I come from the very beginning, you go back to, I wrote papers on, call it mitigation strategies very early on. I'm still writing them. If you read the papers properly, it's not a blank sheet there. But from the very beginning, my work has always been based upon what I regard as a common person. What does a common person have access to? The medical situation and health situation in this country, and actually the world, but it's a disaster. It's a total disaster, okay? In my opinion, this business of, I mean, I don't want to get into this diatribe because people probably, they won't want to put up with it. But people deserve to live in good health and spirit, and it should not be dependent upon money or specialization. Anything that I do is based upon a standpoint of access and rights of the public towards means and measures. And in the real world, no matter what we're doing with drugs, in the real world, it comes down to the laws of nature. Go study the origin of medicine and plants and what happened there and how it's evolved into what it is, which is a disaster. But nutrition is at the heart of this. And let's just say I try to incorporate into my work always from the very beginning, what would be a nutritional approach to this? Understanding that I regard nutrition as, actually, when you think about it, it's the ultimate source of any energy for the body. You know, I'm not a saint, and I don't eat in some specific, high class gluten form, but I know that what I eat is a source of my energy. And the drugs that are going on, it's primarily an alteration and a circumvention process to accomplish a specific goal. And now it's to accomplish that goal at any cost, no matter how much it's going to screw you up. Sorry, here goes the diatribe. But anyway, I wrote many years ago that the nutritionists and the functional medicine group are two groups to be honored here, okay, in terms of understanding a direction that can be taken. And I'm not saying that there's not other methods that can be chosen. I'm not saying that the devices don't have any relevance at all. I'm not denying medical history. I think my life has been saved twice that I know of. I'm not trying to degrade anything. I'm just trying to say I come from a place of human rights, not right of status by class or financial position. So I don't even consider other methods because they don't satisfy my criteria. Doesn't mean they don't exist. I'm sure you can make some nice fancy drugs at some point that happen to have the side effect of killing your liver or whatever. I just don't come from there.
Without giving medical advice, so one of the things that you discovered was that the CBD thrives in acidic environments.
Yeah.
So I think in the natural health movement, there is already a lot of activity. Well, I think it's already generally recognized that if you stay alkaline, that's a healthy state for your body, and that almost any disease starts with acidity. So focusing on this alkaline health habits that would be well, without giving the health recommendation, that would be one thing that you can do without the doctor's advice, right?
If you tell me these functional groups, sorry, I'm willing to study a little bit. But if you give me these functional groups, for everyone you give me, I probably come up with 3 or 4 things to do. So if I have 8 of them there, I probably have 24 things on my mind right away.
Yes.
I have to be willing to do some research and study. There's no way around it. I'm sorry, I'm not going to say a pill. I don't believe in the pill. I think you need to understand the problem. So, yeah, the whole alkaline thing, one of the many, there it is, pH regulation on this list, right? pH regulation. And I don't want to get too technical about this, but this field creates a mire of opportunity for marginalization of the topic, and people just have to get past that. And they'll dismiss the whole thing immediately by saying, "Well, you can't change your blood," and it's true. Your blood is really extremely well defined, but guess what? Your blood is not the whole picture here. We're talking about the entire body. And yes, I saw somewhere in one book they went so far to say that almost every organic chemical reaction was an acid-base reaction, and it made my life simpler. But I started to question it, and it didn't come out quite that simple. But let's just say it's on the right track. Acid-base reactions are involved, you can say, in the majority or a massive fraction of every organic reaction that takes place.
So here we showed a slide of all the mitigation strategies, and that need more research and translation into nutrition and supplemental protocols.
Exactly. Very good. And thank you for putting that crusade forth, because that's where it's at right now. There's another paper. There's another paper called Mitigation for the Future. Something like that is in the title. And there's 4 things in there. And once again, people think I'm too general. They want the pill or the device. But if you read those 4 things, they're absolutely profound in terms of what they mean you should be doing. It sets a cascade of action in place if you understand what it says. And by the way, those 4 measures are right at the front end of most any pathology book. I have a book from 1976, a pathology book. It's down in Utah right now. It's fascinating to me. It's a 5-inch book, really small print. And I only made it through the first 30 pages in terms of actually reading it. Not because it was hard, but because it just astounded me and overwhelmed me about what was said in these first 30 pages. I don't have the life right now to go through the 700 to 1,000 pages, but the 30 were just amazing to me, because this book is written in 1976. It's a standard, well-known pathology book. And they say at the very beginning of this book, they say there are 3 causes of disease. And I loved it. They didn't say there are 3 causes of measles, there are 3 causes of chickenpox. They said there are 3 causes of disease, and they listed them. Okay.
And what are the 3 causes?
Well, I don't know. I remember them in my head, but I will say this: they have to do things with oxidation is a huge issue. Oxidation of cells. We could dig them up. The membrane, disruption of the membrane is another, cellular membrane. That'll be 2. I'd have to work a little bit on the other. I know the whole peroxidation thing in the liver comes in there, but basically it's fundamental chemistry is, I guess, what I'm saying. Very fundamental chemistry processes, exactly the same as I have listed, of the same ilk and nature as I've listed in that paper that I'm telling you about that has the word mitigation and strategy. Some people look at that, they look at that pathology book and they look at that paper and say, "Oh, what do I do with this? I don't know what to do with this." And in my book, that 30 pages of that pathology book, they drove me for years on end, okay? Because they did not qualify themselves saying that a specific disease. They said every disease. And so I started looking for common ground in what I am finding in this synthetic biology against what they were saying, okay? Oxidation was a great example. We could talk for an hour or 2 on oxidation. And I said, guess what? I see the exact same thing in what I am viewing as synthetic biology and the harm that is likely to occur from it. I see exactly the same thing that they pronounce at the very beginning of a pathology book, that this is what you need to be working with. And it had nothing to do with any specific disease, nor whether it was synthetic biology or not, and any contraption human beings try to throw into the mix. And I claim that the laws of nature, they apply in all cases, above and beyond human beings. And it was fascinating to me, and it still drives me in the same way. Minds work in different ways, but I get very detailed in my work at some point, always. But I love to know the overriding principle. I do this in science all the time. There are these fundamental principles. They set the stage for just an infinite journey ahead of you. And to me, it's more, let's say, self-evident when I see this, because yes, I built up a little framework, but there's a lot of people that have studied more than I have, and they know more than I do about things. And I'm saying, jump in. There's no excuse. Jump in.
So the nonprofit that will start working with you, because I think some people need a little bit more explanation. I only have chemistry from my from high school. So, for example, these mitigation measures it identified with oxidation damage and free radical damage, and I think, okay, now I'm thinking antioxidants. And when you say the cell membrane, I'm thinking of fatty acids. So not all the unsaturated fats and or what? Sorry, the vegetable oils and stuff. But when you say foreign protein creation in the human body, then I was wondering, there is this whole agenda for us to not eat meat anymore and eat a lot of precision fermented and lab cultured fake proteins. So I was wondering, because we get our proteins, well, the best proteins you get from meat because they have all the amino acids, right? Is there a reason for this war on eating meat, or have you?
Your 85% protein, I think, is the number. Okay, I think living creatures are formed of 4 different types of molecules. If I get this right, one is proteins, one is DNA is another, carbohydrates is another, and lipids is another. Fats. You're 85% protein, as I recall the number. No matter what the number is, it's very significant, and you are who you are, and your structure is because of that. I don't think I would be in a position of trying to interfere with the existence or presence of proteins, other than I would like to make a distinction between those that are, call it, natural to this wonderful human species versus those that might be introduced of a harmful nature. So in my mind, I was never at a point of trying to say I eliminate one of the 4 fundamental biomolecules of life. And the path of, to me, organic chemistry study and reactivity. Let's just say the clue. I've been saying it. I said it years ago in a presentation. I talked about how proteins are going to be important for us in the future in understanding this. And I brought up cases of major diseases that we deal with. And I'm sorry if I'm taking too long, but we have examples of, like, Alzheimer's were given and HIV were given. And what they said was that the leading edge of research in many of the major diseases that we have, the leading line of research is that of disruption, first of all, understanding of the proteins that exist. And when you talk about folding, that's a huge, huge issue. Geometry is important. It's not just a protein. Protein have 4 different levels of structure to them. And you tweak a little protein and it's all different. And folding of proteins is a very huge deal. One of the strongest lines of research is to learn what the proteins behind the disease or condition are and how to disrupt them. Okay. That's like a huge little clue that's being given that I've been trying to impart, what's on all my papers, and I've been doing it for years, of saying, that one of your most effective strategies that you want to be working on as soon as possible is you get to the proteins, you understand their nature, and you learn how to interfere with them. And beyond that, we go into the 2024 notebook.
Okay, good. So I think we've gone through a lot. There's one thing that I want to raise before finalizing is that, of course, we talked about your laboratory research right now, but your findings basically raise all the journalistic questions. Where is this coming from? Well, you have a part of the what, but somebody invented this. And who is this somebody? Because we are still taught in the overt world that we have a system of sovereign nation states that perhaps cooperate on a global level. And Catherine she coined the term Mr. Global. But here you run into also the question, what is our governance system? Because we're being told right now we are at the brink of a nuclear war between Russia and China. And there is this nuclear offensive. But if you look at the CBD, the spraying has been happening in all countries. It's been seen everywhere, also in Russia and China. So how can they be against each other but cooperating on this level? And even if they weren't spraying this, then just because it's been dispersed in the atmosphere, they are finding this all over the world. So if they find a foreign biological agent that is making their population sick, this will be the number one topic at the Security Council. But it's part of this big omerta worldwide. So yeah, we talked about the chemical part, about the health part, but your research raises so many other questions that requires a lot of other people and researchers to dive into, I believe.
I like your questions and I like your sensibility.
So, well, you're welcome.
I'm going to comment on that just a little bit, if I can.
Mhm.
And as you are asking the right questions and you're raising the questions which make sense, right? And so what I think is to me, it presents, I call it a sort of a fundamental problem with the human species. We're not perfect. We've got some problems. We definitely have some behavioral issues, and I don't know of any other species in the whole planet that conducts organized warfare in the way that we do. A couple chimpanzees don't count. So you have this issue where the common approach is to want to try to attach this issue to a country or a government or a person. You want to who, what, why, where, and why. You always want those things, okay? And you want to who, and you want to who. In general, we want things to be within our sphere of consideration. Another term might be our comfort zone. Some of us think we have a comfort zone that can push out a little bit further than others, and some not so much. But ultimately, most of us seem to want to place this within what I would call our sphere of consideration and comprehension. And that commonly attempts to attribute what we're speaking of, to a particular nation, as you're saying, or a country, some type of, quote, authoritative body we want to attach to that. And again, I go by what I see, and I'm not attached to a particular government or authoritative body in my life. I have no attachment to it. I realize I have certain dictates placed upon me by my life and where I am, but I don't view any country as being the divine ruler in this world. And when you look at this issue, you can't logically attach it to any particular country. For the very reasons that you just cited. You simply cannot do it. You cannot have it fall under the jurisdiction of any nation or state. You have a heck of a time trying to have it fall under some international organization, since we know the public face of those international organizations is also a disaster. in terms of its dysfunction and ability to work together. So you'd have a really hard time giving this level of sophistication to a body that doesn't show it to be able to operate in any functional sense at a world level. So I don't know how to say this, in a nice way, but we must extend our sphere of consideration to that which is above. And this is where we get to play with language and decide where we want to go. But we must consider above the nation or world state of affairs. We must. And I'm not going to get into that whole discussion because it's one of those many discussions that are on the horizon for us. It's ripe and absolutely delightful fun for conjecture and consideration of the world that we don't exactly have too much insight on, at least not directly. It's outside much of the boundaries of science as we know it as well. But this is where the discussion does need to go, whether we like it or not, because there is a requirement, whether you like it or not, that you identify the who, what, when, where, and why. And we haven't done too well on the who, and we have a little bit of progress on really all of them, I think, but we don't have the who, do we?
No.
And no matter what games we play to try and stake we have the rules, and no, we don't have that W properly. So I don't know, that's my comment. The comment is, you don't place bounds on something until you know you have grounds to place those bounds. Not grounds. I didn't mean that, but you don't have grounds to do it. That's why a culture, right? You're working as culture because you have this little thing that or your lab, you have this thing you try to set conditions on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sorry, you're inept right now on setting conditions on the origin of this phenomenon. If you want to be, that's a nice, polite term for it, isn't it? Or I could call threat to mankind and be the same, speaking of the same thing.
So looking forward, what people can follow your work at Carnicom Institute and at the Carnicom Institute website. And of course, we should ask for support of your work, not just by subscribing, but also, if possible, by donating. But more importantly, it's about maintaining your legacy and translating all these really, really important research results. Well, I mentioned this a couple of times because worldwide we're seeing this general malaise. People are sick. We have sudden death. We have excess mortality. And so many doctors are looking at this and they still feel puzzled, and they should just look at your work and they would have so many more avenues to find solutions. So yeah, what else can we do to bring this to a broader public?
I'll mention just in passing, the website is .org on the end, ORG. And there is a misdirection that takes place with some people if they go to the com world, because that's little games have been played there in the past by certain parties, I guess you would say. So I guess if you think Carnicom Institute, try to remember it's nonprofit. So where this is going to me is, I saw once a book of names and what names mean. I was adopted, so my name was changed in the last name anyway. But I found the name Clifford there, and it was interesting to me because it's actually pretty straightforward. It presented an association of a person that's on a cliff and looking ahead. Now, I don't know if the book was right or not, but if I have a role, as I've looked at myself both professionally and as well as the way I view things over time, I see my role primarily as just trying to help out and just give a path to go to look to. It's just a start of a process. It's not an end. And so to me, it's obvious what needs to be done, and what needs to be done. It's not me. I'm 71 years old. I've had a fledgling nonprofit for 2 decades in terms of both ability to get information distributed as well as funding. It's I wouldn't cast aspersion on anyone that ever supports what we've done, but it's totally and completely inadequate, and the scale factor is numerous exponents. Okay, in terms of where this needed to be. This is not even talking about the future. The work in the past for the 25 years before needed to be at multiple exponents of what has taken place with respect to resources and funding. I've said casually that the entire CDC budget for the last decade could easily have been consumed in this, if you accept the reality of the effect and threat to human existence and biology in general. So it's already way out of proportion before we even get to now. But I'm 71. We can all have our fantasies, and I keep asking for extensions, and I've been granted a couple already, and I'm very grateful for that. But sorry, none of this is here forever, and so it's obvious to me what should happen. And what's obvious is you make up for the past to begin with, get yourself in gear, make up for the past, get all that stuff in place. This means proper labs. This means proper people. It means honest people. It means systems that are not corrupted. I have this whole model. I'm sorry, you're getting me going on this diatribe, but I have this whole model for the whole world economy that it never needed to be money. The whole world could be a nonprofit economy, and people can make billions of dollars. There's no restriction how much money you can make with a nonprofit. The question model is the question what you do with it. And I'm saying you serve the public good, and go ahead and get the millions for the people that deserve it for their various ways. But you need the labs, you need the qualified staff, and this is already past tense. You needed all the funding at the proper level, the right instruments. If you could only have any sense, I've told people before, you can equate what I'm doing to trying to operate in 1880 with the lab. I have one or two exceptions to that. But in general, I'm working with 1880 technology and means, with a couple of exceptions. So get yourself up a couple hundred years in technology, resources, staffing, and honest people doing work, and actually be willing to state forward with their name that they are working for the public good, as opposed to how much money they can make. And now project that same thing forward. You take all that you needed to make up for the last 25 years, and now you project it forward, and you do the same thing, but guess what? You keep expanding and expanding it until you get the answers you need. And this is where it has to be. It has Carnicom Institute. Fine, I appreciate anything and everything that's done, but I'm telling you, the scale of the problem is so above the idea of donating to a presidential fund with $5, no matter whether you had 1 million people or not. I'm sorry. You're talking about a global event that is deeply rooted. And one of our biggest problems is the willingness to face that which is beyond our sphere of consideration. And it's not just consideration, it is implementation at the deepest levels. Mm. And I'm not much for making excuses. I'm not really very good at forgiving when I think that a wrong has been committed. I'm sorry. Maybe the next life I become better at that, but I don't excuse what's happened. There's no excuse for me whatsoever for what has taken place. And I obligate everyone in this world to fully engage themselves and help each other and humankind in general. And do not just want a selfish quick answer, but help fellow human beings. Because we're in it together, whether we like it or know it or not. I love these questions I had over the years in the emails just saying, I see this stuff in the sky. Where can I go to get away from this? Do you know any secret countries I should go to? It's like I couldn't even begin to respond to those emails other than in the general effect of my public presentations.
We are all in this together. And your work should really be taken on by so many other people. And I hope that this interview will help with that.
Thank you very much. Again, I regard you as one of the wonderful, sensible people of the world, and it's been an absolute delight to share it with you. And we know that such spirit exists in the world, don't we?
Yes. Thank you so much for this interview, Clifford.
You're very welcome, Elze. I appreciate it fully.
What do you think is really happening in this world? Like, most conventional people are under the impression that it's if you have depression or anxiety or some sort of illness, it's either, you caught a bacteria or you have neurotransmitter imbalance. What do you feel if you have to take a big step back and see it all? Do you think it's a matter of light versus dark? What's the biggest scope you can say that's happening on the world?
Well, of course, that's I could give many answers to that, but I think light versus dark is the shortest way of expressing it. I in different lectures that I give, so I make it very clear. We don't have to go into the details. In Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian mystic that was very active in the early part of the last century, the founder of Waldorf schools and biodynamic farming and a completely new kind of alternative medicine. He predicted, that towards the end of last century and the beginning of this century, there will be a movement driven by big corporations to take the soul away from people, to disconnect people from the higher world. And in order to do that, we have to destroy the pineal gland in people. And I followed the research on that, and amazingly, what we found, the pineal gland is the most sensitive part of our central nervous system, and is highly, highly, highly sensitive to 4 things: aluminum, glyphosate, fluoride, and Wi-Fi. And we are the only country in the world that has pushed these 4 things in the last 60 years or so on everybody growing up here. And so what I feel, what I observe, and what we're also testing in our ART system is that people have severely calcified pineal glands. And I show the anatomy in some of my courses. It's very clear that the pineal gland is a receiver for higher fields of energy and translates them into thought and into actually controlling our immune system, our endocrine system, and so on and so forth. There's all science, but very few people pay attention to science anymore, especially since Donald Trump and his disregard for science. It's become the new norm. And so it is astounding that the telecommunications industry has selected the frequencies out of the huge spectrum of frequencies that are absolutely destructive to our cells and especially to the pineal gland. They couldn't have made any better choices than 2.4 gigahertz. That the end point, that when you have inhale aluminum, as we do from the Bioengineering program, and have glyphosate in the food chain, that glyphosate and aluminum combine in the blood and in the gut and in the bloodstream to form 6 different chemical compounds where aluminum and glyphosate are hooked up together. And the end point of that compound is the pineal gland. Published, it's not my idea. And what is needed for this compound to actually enter the brain is to open up the blood-brain barrier. And the current frequencies in the Wi-Fi world are exactly doing that. They open the blood-brain barrier, so toxins that used to stay in the bloodstream and in the body below the neck are now entering the brain very freely. That applies to all toxins. And so it's a new time in that way, and so, when you think this through, you come to the conclusion that either there must have been an ultra intelligence group of scientists who have designed this protocol to fluoridate the drinking water, to put nanonized aluminum in the air, to put glyphosate in the food, and then activate it, spark it with the right frequencies. It took me 20 years to figure out the perfect storm that is created there. And it's either a coincidence, which is possible, that enough dumb people made the wrong choices, along the years. I'm still hoping that may be at least partially true. Or it's orchestrated by a very, very intelligent group of destructive minds. Or what I also believe is very possible, that there's some higher fields of consciousness that can be both tuned into the light and to life affirmative action, and can be absolutely destructive, like phenomena like Adolf Hitler and others, people that come under the influence of something absolutely dark and destructive. And I do believe it's very possible that enough scientists and politicians have come under that influence of those higher fields and are acting according to it, actually not knowing on a human level why they're doing what they're doing and what they're doing. A good example is 5G. Sort of to put it on posts, along the streets. Okay, that's one issue, but putting it on satellite and actually the government approving to put it on satellite, blasting the whole planet with a frequency that has never been checked for safety, for its influence on the insects, on the songbirds, has never been checked for anything, and to approve that is unconceivable to like somebody who's still got a little bit of a brain left. And that politicians in the White House and other countries are conspiring with that can only be explained that their brains have come under the influence of some larger, higher field that cannot be human in nature, because the human nature is always life affirmative and loving and wanting to live and make the biosphere more friendly to life. And so there's some scary thoughts about that, but I'm still hoping, I'm still putting my weight on, let's hope it's just a coincidence and enough dumb people made enough dumb decisions, and if enough of us wake up and point it out to them, that there can be a reversal. The Wi-Fi can be switched off in a second. We'd be done with that. And, glyphosate could be forbidden, tomorrow. It's in the water table for many years, but there could be an end to it. The chemtrail program could be stopped like that. So the good thing is that positive solutions that are suppressed right now, that are everywhere, could be the norm of tomorrow. Within 24 hours, we could turn the planet from a creature that is threatened on all levels to paradise, virtually within 24 hours. We're still close enough to that.